On the morning of Easter Sunday, 1722, Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to set eyes on Tepito Otehenua, the navel of the world. He expected open ocean. Instead, rising from the surfline of a tiny volcanic island in the remotest corner of the Pacific, stood hundreds of colossal stone figures, the Moai, each one carved from compressed volcanic ash, some weighing 80 tons, all of them staring inland with a watchful gravity that seemed to belong to a civilization of enormous ambition and confidence. But the people Roggeveen found did not match the monuments. Where he might have expected thousands, he found hundreds. The stone platforms were cracked. Some of the great statues had been pulled down. The island, once thick with palm forest according to the geological record, looked stripped and wind-swept. The question Roggeveen could not answer would echo forward through 300 years of scholarship, classroom lessons, and TED Talks. How does a civilization that builds wonders destroy itself so completely? The answer, finally emerging from the soil and the genomes of the island, is nothing like the story we were told. For decades after Roggeveen's voyage, the mystery of Easter Island simmered quietly in the background of Western scholarship. The statues were catalogued, the island was mapped, and eventually a theory emerged that seemed to explain everything. It was elegant, it was dramatic, and for nearly half a century, it was treated as settled history. The theory went like this. At its peak, sometime around 1200 to 1500 CE, the island supported a population of perhaps 15,000 people, a remarkable number for a speck of land covering only 63 square miles in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. These people, the Rapa Nui, had built one of the most extraordinary monumental cultures the ancient world had ever produced. The Moai, those great stone figures, were not merely decorative. They were Ahu Moai, ancestral symbols erected on ceremonial platforms called Ahu, each one requiring enormous coordinated labor to quarry, carve, and transport across the island's rocky terrain. Hundreds of them, some weighing as much as 80 tons. But the theory held that this ambition became an addiction. To move the statues, the Rapa Nui needed logs, vast quantities of them, used as rollers and sledges. And so, according to this narrative, they cut and cut and cut again. The island had once been blanketed by millions of Jubaiya palms, a now extinct species whose fossilized pollen had been found in sediment cores pulled from the island's crater lakes. By the time Europeans arrived, those palms were gone. The deforestation, the theory argued, had been catastrophic and self-inflicted. Without trees, the topsoil eroded. Without topsoil, the crops failed. Without food, the social order collapsed into warfare, and some accounts even invoked cannibalism as evidence of a society that had consumed itself whole. This was the story that Jared Diamond crystallized for a global audience in his 2005 book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Diamond presented Easter Island as the cleanest possible parable for modern environmentalism, a people who had everything, who took too much, and who paid with everything. The book sold millions of copies. The story migrated into university syllabi, documentary films, and TED Talks watched by tens of millions of people. Easter Island became shorthand, a single image standing in for every warning about human short-sightedness and ecological overshoot. It was, on its surface, a deeply compelling narrative. It had a clear villain, a clear mechanism, and a clear moral. And for a while, the early physical evidence seemed to support it. Pollen cores from Rano Raraku and Rano Kau, the island's two main crater lakes, showed an unmistakable decline in palm pollen over the centuries leading up to European contact. Rat bones found in archaeological deposits suggested that Polynesian rats, introduced by the first settlers, had also eaten palm seeds and accelerated the forest's disappearance. The deforestation was real. On that point, no serious researcher disagreed. What no one questioned carefully enough, for a very long time, was what the deforestation actually meant. The ecocide theory rested on a chain of assumptions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one compounding the last. Deforestation led to agricultural collapse. Agricultural collapse led to starvation. Starvation led to warfare. Warfare led to population crash. It was a tidy sequence. It was also, as a new generation of scientists would discover, almost entirely wrong in its ordering, its timing, and its cause. This was the story the world accepted. But history is rarely a story of people destroying themselves. Usually, it is a story of people adapting until something external arrives to destroy them. And today, thanks to a convergence of paleoecological data, isotope analysis of human remains, and groundbreaking genetic research conducted through the 2000s, the centuries-old verdict on Easter Island is being overturned, not revised at the margins, but fundamentally dismantled. The answers emerging from the island's soil and bones are not a tale of reckless self-destruction. They are a tale of resilience, sophistication, and a catastrophe that came not from within, but from the sea. The cracks in the ecocide theory did not appear all at once. They appeared the way most scientific revolutions begin, quietly, in the margins of papers that most people never read, written by researchers who were simply trying to make the numbers add up. In the early 2000s, a team of archaeologists and paleoecologists affiliated with the University of California, Santa Barbara began cross-referencing the island's sediment core data against a new body of evidence, the isotopic signatures locked inside ancient Rapa Nui bones. Isotope analysis is a technique that reads the chemical ratios preserved in skeletal remains to reconstruct what a person ate, where they lived, and how stressed their body was during life. What the bones of pre-contact Rapa Nui individuals showed was not a population in the grip of famine. The nitrogen and carbon ratios indicated a varied, stable diet, seafood, cultivated crops, the yields of a people who were managing their environment, not being destroyed by it. At roughly the same time, other researchers were returning to the pollen core data with sharper questions. The palm decline was real, but its timeline, examined more carefully, was neither sudden nor chaotic. It stretched across centuries, and scattered through the sediment layers were other signals that the earlier analysis had not fully accounted for: microscopic traces of cultivated plant species, evidence of deliberate burning for agricultural clearing rather than reckless deforestation, and the chemical fingerprints of purposefully managed soil. The Rapa Nui, it appeared, were not destroying their landscape. They were transforming it. Meanwhile, something else had been hiding in plain sight for decades, visible from the air, but only properly surveyed by satellite imaging in the 2000s. Scattered across the island's interior were thousands of monavai, small circular enclosures built from stacked stone, some no larger than a dining table, others covering several square meters. These rock gardens were not decorative. They were sophisticated microclimatic tools designed to trap moisture, block the island's relentless wind, and concentrate nutrients in the thin volcanic soil. Researchers identified more than 2,000 of them. A civilization does not build 2,000 precise agricultural enclosures if it has abandoned rational thought in favor of statue-building obsession. It builds them because it is determined to survive. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui descendants had insisted for generations that their ancestors were not self-destroyers. These stories, passed down through the Tangata Rongorongo, the keepers of the island's undeciphered script, described a people of ingenuity and endurance, not reckless hubris. For over a century, mainstream scholarship had treated these accounts as romantic mythology, the natural tendency of any people to idealize their own past. The soil and the bones were now suggesting that the oral traditions had been right all along. History is rarely a story of civilizations consuming themselves lives in a frenzy of short-sighted greed. Usually, it is a story of people finding every possible way to endure until something arrives from outside that they cannot endure. And by the early 2020s, a convergence of disciplines was pointing toward exactly that kind of external force. Paleobotany, satellite archaeology, and ancient genomics were all beginning to tell the same story, from different directions, in different languages, arriving at the same destination. The first crack had appeared in the ecocide myth. What the researchers found next, buried in the island's crater lake sediments and in the DNA of the dead, would split it open entirely. The modern breakthrough began not with a dramatic excavation, but with a researcher sitting in a laboratory in Santiago, Chile, holding a glass tube of lake sediment that had already been studied a dozen times before. Dr. Valentin Roule, a paleoecologist whose work on Easter Island spans more than 2 decades, returned in the early 2000s to the sediment cores extracted from Rano Raraku, the volcanic crater lake that sits at the foot of the island's main quarry, where the moai were carved. Previous analyses of these cores had focused almost exclusively on the decline of palm pollen, treating it as the central story. Roule looked at the full picture. What he found, published across a series of papers between 2010 and 2021, forced a fundamental rereading of the island's ecological history. The palm decline was not a sudden crash. It was a gradual, centuries-long process that began around 800 CE and continued at a slow pace well past the period when the ecocide model claimed the island should already have been in terminal collapse. More critically, the sediment layers showed that as the palms disappeared, other pollen signatures increased. Cultivated species, grasses managed for agriculture, plants associated with deliberate land clearing rather than catastrophic burning. The forest was not being destroyed. It was being converted, methodically, by a people who understood what they were doing with their land. What made this finding so significant was not just what the cores contained, it was what they did not contain. In archaeology, the absence of evidence is often the most powerful evidence of all. If the ecocide model were correct, if the Rapa Nui had suffered a cascading agricultural collapse beginning around 1400 to 1600 CCE, the sediment record should be full of the chemical signatures of erosion. Sudden spikes in charcoal from uncontrolled fires, sharp increases in soil particles washing into the lake from denuded hillsides, a dramatic narrowing of the pollen diversity as plant life retreated. None of these signals appear with the timing or intensity the ecocide thesis requires. The island's ecological record does not look like a disaster. It looks like a managed transition. This picture was made even more vivid by the Manavai. These stone-walled garden enclosures, built directly into the island's volcanic surface, had been documented since the early 20th century, but their true scale was only revealed when researchers combined satellite imagery with ground survey data in the 2000s and 2000s. More than 2,000 individual Manavai have now been identified across Easter Island's interior and coastal zones. They range in diameter from roughly 1 meter to more than 5, and their construction required considerable skill. The walls were not simply stacked rocks. They were carefully arranged to deflect the island's near-constant easterly winds, trapping warmth and moisture within the enclosure and creating a protected microclimate in which crops, sweet potato, taro, sugarcane, could thrive in conditions that would otherwise make cultivation extremely difficult. These were not the tools of a civilization in panic. They were the tools of a civilization in problem-solving mode, one that had recognized a changing environment and engineered a precise, localized response to it. The skeletal record delivered the same verdict from a different direction. Isotope analysis of human remains dating to the centuries before European contact, work conducted by researchers including Anna Gosling and her colleagues, published in the early 2020s, found no evidence of the widespread nutritional stress that a true famine event would leave inscribed in bone. Growth plate development, bone density, and the chemical ratios of nitrogen and carbon in the remains all pointed to a population eating adequately, drawing on a diverse food base that included both cultivated crops and marine resources. There were no mass graves from this period. There were no skeletal trauma patterns consistent with large-scale organized warfare. The ecocide model predicted starvation, collapse, and internal violence on a society-wide scale for the period between roughly 1400 and 1700 CE. The bones showed none of it. The soil told one story. The bones confirmed it. But the sharpest clue of all, the one that would finally pinpoint when and why the Rapa Nui population crashed, came not from what the island held in its earth, but from what their own DNA held in its code. When archaeologists stopped looking at what the islanders cut down and started looking at what the islanders left behind in their own bodies, the timeline of Easter Island's collapse shifted entirely. Ancient DNA analysis, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from skeletal remains, has transformed historical research over the past 2 decades. Applied to Easter Island, it delivered a finding that no version of the ecocide theory could accommodate. A landmark study published in 2020 in the journal Current Biology, led by a team including researchers from the Institut Pasteur in Paris, sequenced the genomes of ancient Rapa Nui individuals spanning multiple centuries of pre-contact occupation. The genetic data was unambiguous. The pre-contact Rapa Nui population showed no sign of a catastrophic demographic collapse. Genetic diversity remained stable. There was no bottleneck, no sudden narrowing of the gene pool that would indicate a population crash anywhere in the period that the ecocide model identifies as the era of self-destruction. A genetic bottleneck is what happens when a population is reduced so severely and so suddenly that only a small number of individuals survive to reproduce. It leaves a permanent scar in the genome of every subsequent generation, a measurable compression of diversity that geneticists can identify and date with considerable precision. In the Rapa Nui ancient DNA record, this scar does not appear in the 1400s. It does not appear in the 1500s. It does not appear in the 1600s. It appears after 1722. The pre-contact skeletal record reinforced this with equal clarity. Bioarchaeological analysis of bone collections dating to the centuries before Roggeveen's arrival showed normal population-level health indicators. Dental development was consistent with adequate childhood nutrition. Long bone growth was uninterrupted. There were no mass burial sites from this period, no trauma patterns on skeletal remains suggesting organized society-wide warfare, no sign of the desperate grinding violence that the ecocide narrative had long implied was the island's pre-contact reality. One burial assemblage excavated near the ceremonial complex of Ahu Nau Nau on the island's northern coast proved particularly telling. The individuals interred there, dating to the 15th and 16th centuries, precisely the period the ecocide model identifies as the height of societal collapse, showed bone density and development entirely consistent with a well-nourished population. They were not starving. They were not at war. They were, to all biological appearances, a functioning society in the middle of a difficult but managed environmental transition. The timeline problem this created for the ecocide thesis was not a minor inconvenience. It was fatal. If deforestation had triggered the collapse that Diamond and others described, a collapse beginning around 1400 CE and accelerating through the 1500s and 1600s, then the genetic and skeletal evidence should confirm it. Population crashes leave marks. Famines leave marks. Generations of warfare leave marks. The Rapa Nui bones and genomes from this period carry none of them. What the evidence showed, instead, was a people who had survived their deforested landscape, adapted to it with ingenuity continuity, maintained their population, and preserved their culture, right up until the moment European ships appeared on the horizon. Something arrived with Roggeveen's ships, and it did not arrive in their cargo holds. To understand what really ended the Rapa Nui civilization as it had existed for nearly 1,000 years, researchers had to look not at the island's forests or its fields or even its bones, but at the specific, documented chain of events that followed that first April morning in 1722, a chain that would unfold over the next century and a half with the slow, grinding thoroughness of a civilization being systematically dismantled from the outside. Return for a moment to that April morning in 1722. Jacob Roggeveen's ships drop anchor. His crew rows to shore. The encounter is brief, a few days at most, and ends without serious violence. Roggeveen departs, and Easter Island recedes back into the Pacific, unknown to the wider world for another 4 decades. But something stayed behind. European ships in the 18th century were vectors of biological catastrophe for any population that had never encountered the diseases of the Old World. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, and a range of other infections moved through immunologically naive populations with a speed and lethality that eyewitness accounts consistently struggled to describe. Roggeveen's visit was the first in a sequence of European contacts that would strike Easter Island across the following century and a half like a series of hammer blows, each one landing before the population had recovered from the last. In 1770, a Spanish expedition under Felipe González de Haedo arrived, claiming the island for the Spanish crown and staying long enough to introduce additional disease exposure. In 1774, the British explorer James Cook visited and recorded a population already visibly diminished from Roggeveen's earlier estimates, noting in his journals that the islanders appeared fewer in number and the great stone platforms in a state of increasing disrepair. Cook did not know he was documenting the early stages of a demographic collapse. He thought he was observing the aftermath of internal conflict. He was wrong about the cause, but accurate about the trajectory. Then came 1805. An American sealing vessel, the Nancy, anchored off the island's coast and kidnapped 12 men and 10 women, chaining them in the hold and transporting them toward the South American coast for use as forced labor. Most died or escaped before reaching their destination. The raid itself was brief. Its effect on a small island population, the terror, the disruption, the deaths, was not. What followed in 1862 was not a raid. It was an annihilation. Between December 1862 and early 1863, a fleet of Peruvian slave ships descended on Easter Island in coordinated waves, capturing an estimated 1,500 people, approximately 1/3 of the island's entire remaining population. Among those taken were the Ariki, the hereditary chiefs who held political authority, and the Tangata Rongorongo, the trained specialists who could read and write the island's unique Rongorongo script, one of only a handful of independent writing systems ever developed in human history. These were not random captures. The Peruvian recruiters, as they euphemistically called themselves, understood that visible community leaders were easier to convince others to follow. They targeted the island's intellectual and governing class with devastating precision. The captives were transported to the Guano Islands off the Peruvian coast, where they were forced to work in conditions of extreme deprivation. Disease moved through the labor camps rapidly. Of the roughly 1,500 Rapa Nui individuals taken in the 1862 to 1863 raids, records confirm that the vast majority died within months. When international pressure, led in part by French missionary organizations, finally compelled Peru to release the survivors and return them to Easter Island, only a handful of ships made the voyage. Smallpox broke out during the return journey. Of the approximately 100 individuals who survived long enough to be repatriated, most arrived already dying. Fewer than 15 reached the island alive. The 1877 Chilean census recorded the total surviving population of Easter Island, 111 people. From a peak of perhaps 15,000 at the height of Rapa Nui civilization to 111 souls schools in the space of a century and a half. This was not the self-inflicted wound of a people who had cut down too many trees. This was the systematic destruction of a civilization by external forces, disease, abduction, and colonial extraction, carried out across a period that mainstream scholarship had spent decades attributing to internal collapse. The ecocide thesis was not merely incomplete. In its assignment of cause, it was categorically wrong. Research conducted through the 2020s, synthesizing the genetic, paleoecological, and historical record, has now confirmed this timeline with a clarity that has moved it from the margins of academic debate to its center. The people who built the Moai did not destroy themselves. They were destroyed. And the distinction, it turns out, changes everything about what the story of Easter Island actually means. But history does not end at its lowest point, and neither did the Rapa Nui. Today, approximately 8,000 people of Rapa Nui descent are alive on the island, in Chile, and scattered across the Pacific. The language is still spoken. Children learn it in schools. Carvers still work the gray volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku, shaping forms that their ancestors shaped 1,000 years ago, their hands moving through the same gestures, following the same proportions, guided by knowledge that survived the slave raids, the epidemics, and a century of colonial administration that explicitly tried to suppress it. A civilization reduced to 111 people did not disappear. It compressed itself to its most essential elements and held on. For generations, the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui had insisted on exactly this, that the people had endured, that the Moai were not the obsession of a doomed civilization, but the expression of a thriving one, and that what broke the island was not internal madness, but external assault. Mainstream scholarship dismissed these accounts as the predictable mythology of a traumatized people trying to salvage dignity from disaster. They were wrong. The vindication arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. New excavations conducted at the quarry site of Rano Raraku between 2019 and 2023, led by researcher Jo-Ann van Tilburg and the Easter Island Statue Project, produced a finding that directly overturned one of the ecocide theory's foundational assumptions. The Moai buried up to their necks in the quarry, the iconic images most people associate with Easter Island, were not abandoned mid-construction because a starving society could no longer sustain the effort. The sediment surrounding the buried statues contained large quantities of red pigment, food waste, and freshwater algae, indicating that the quarry site was an active, organized, well-provisioned working environment at the time the statues were set in place. The Moai were not the symptom of a civilization collapsing under its own ambitions. They were the product of a civilization confident enough in its food supply to organize large-scale, coordinated labor. The question of how those statues were moved, long cited as evidence of the irrational tree cutting that supposedly caused deforestation, was also resolved. Experimental archaeology conducted by Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt demonstrated that the Moai could be walked upright using ropes and coordinated teams, a technique that required no logs whatsoever. The oral traditions had described exactly this method for generations, speaking of the statues as having walked to their platforms under their own power. Archaeologists had treated this as legend. It was, in fact, a reasonably accurate description of the engineering technique. Perhaps the most direct vindication of oral history came from a specific claim that Rapa Nui descendants had long maintained, that the Moai were not simply monuments to ancestors, but were deliberately positioned to watch over the agricultural land and freshwater sources their communities depended on. Analysis published in 2019 confirmed this precisely. When researchers mapped the sightlines and positioning of 393 Moai platforms against the island's known freshwater and agricultural zones, the correlation was not random. The statues were oriented, with overwhelming statistical consistency, toward the resources that sustained life. They were not facing the sea in defiance of the world. They were facing inland, watching over the fields, guarding the water. For a century, the academic world called the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui romantic folklore. folklore. The traditions said the Moai walked. They did. The traditions said the Moai watched over the land. They did. The traditions said the people did not destroy themselves. They did not. With the physical evidence finally aligned with the stories that had been passed down through the darkest period in the island's history, scientists turned to the most intimate archive of all, the human genome, to write the final chapter of what actually happened to the civilization that built these things, and to prove that the people who built them are still here. DNA acts as a biological time machine. Locked inside every living cell is a record of ancestry that stretches back not years or decades, but centuries. A molecular archive that neither fire, nor flood, nor colonial erasure can destroy. When researchers began applying ancient genomic analysis to the question of Easter Island's population history, what they found did not merely support the emerging consensus. It extended it into territory that no one had fully anticipated. The most significant genetic study of the Rapa Nui to date was published in 2020 in the journal Current Biology, produced by an international team that included researchers from the Institut Pasteur in Paris and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. By sequencing the complete genomes of ancient Rapa Nui individuals, extracted from skeletal remains spanning the island's pre-contact occupation, and comparing them against both modern Rapa Nui populations and global reference panels, the team was able to reconstruct the island's demographic history with a resolution that earlier methods simply could not achieve. The continuity was unbroken. Modern Rapa Nui individuals carry a clear and direct genetic inheritance from the pre-contact population. There is no evidence of population replacement, no sign that the original inhabitants were swept away and replaced by a different group. The people alive on Easter Island today are, in the most literal biological sense, the descendants of the people who carved the Moai. The disaster of the 19th century compressed the population to a terrifying minimum, but it did not sever the genetic thread. One participant in the broader Rapa Nui genetic research program, a woman living on the island referred to in the published data as Subject RP14, provided mitochondrial DNA that matched, with extraordinary precision, a specific ancient burial excavated from the ceremonial complex at Ahu Akivi. The burial dated to approximately the 15th century. The genetic signature connecting that 600-year-old individual to a living person on the same island was not approximate or suggestive. It was, in the language of population genetics, a direct maternal lineage match. 600 years of history condensed into a single biological thread still running through a living human being. But the genomic research delivered a second revelation, one that reframed the island's entire prehistory in ways the ecocide debate had never considered. Embedded in the ancient Rapa Nui genome, detectable in individuals who lived and died centuries before Rojavin's arrival, was a clear signal of genetic admixture with native South American populations. This admixture event, which the 2020 Current Biology study dated to approximately 1200 CE, indicated that Polynesian voyagers had made contact with the indigenous peoples of South America, most likely the coastal populations of what is now Colombia or Ecuador, roughly 500 years before any European ship crossed the Pacific. This was not a marginal finding. It was a discovery that shattered the image of Easter Island as a remote, isolated society cut off from the wider world by the sheer vastness of the ocean. The Rapa Nui were not marooned. They were navigators. They reached South America and returned. They incorporated new people, new genetics, and almost certainly new crops. The sweet potato, a South American domesticate, was a staple of the Rapa Nui diet and had long puzzled botanists into their island civilization. The people who supposedly destroyed themselves through isolation and ignorance had, in fact, accomplished one of the greatest feats of open ocean navigation in human history. When combined with the paleo-ecological evidence, the skeletal record, and the documented history of post-contact devastation, the genetic data closed the last remaining gaps in the argument. The Rapa Nui were not a cautionary tale about the dangers of insularity. They were a civilization of sophisticated, connected, adaptable people who managed a challenging environment for centuries, maintained their population and culture through a slow ecological transition, and were then catastrophically reduced by a sequence of external shocks, disease, abduction, colonial disruption that arrived from outside and that no degree of internal wisdom or ecological restraint could have prevented. The genetics confirmed what the soil, the bones, and the oral traditions had all been saying from different directions, in different languages, for a very long time. The story of Easter Island has been told for 50 years as a warning. It appeared in textbooks, in lectures, in the opening minutes of environmental documentaries. It was the perfect parable, compact, visual, morally unambiguous. A people with everything. A people who took too much. A people who paid with everything. The lesson was clear. This is what happens when a civilization consumes its own foundations. It is still a warning, but it warns us about something entirely different from what we thought. The Moai were not the monument of a civilization in the grip of irrational obsession. They were the achievement of a sophisticated, well-fed, ocean-going people who had crossed the largest ocean on Earth, made contact with another continent, built a complex society on a remote volcanic island, and engineered precise agricultural systems to sustain it. They positioned their great stone figures to watch over their fields and their water. They carved them with an artistry that required generations of accumulated knowledge. They moved them, upright and walking, using rope and coordination and an understanding of physics that needed no written manual because it lived in the hands and voices of the people who performed it. When the slave ships came in 1862, they did not find a broken people scavenging the ruins of a self-inflicted disaster. They found a functioning community. They took its leaders, its scholars, its memory keepers. They took the people who held the Rongorongo script in their minds, a writing system that remains undeciphered to this day, in part because the men and women who could read it died in Peruvian labor camps before anyone thought to ask them what it said. In 2022, Peru formally acknowledged the 1862 slave raids as a historical injustice and issued an official apology to the Rapa Nui people, a recognition, however belated, that what happened to this island was not the consequence of its inhabitants' choices, but of the choices made by those who arrived uninvited from across the sea. Today, on the slopes of Rano Raraku, a Rapa Nui carver named Petero Edmunds Paua works a piece of volcanic tuff with tools not entirely unlike the ones his ancestors used. The form emerging from the stone is recognizable: the heavy brow, the long chin, the composure of something built to endure. The knowledge of how to make this thing was never written down in any language that outsiders could read. It survived in the only archive that the slave raids and the epidemics could not fully reach: the living memory of the people themselves, passed from hand to hand across the worst century in the island's history, compressed but unbroken. The civilization of Easter Island never truly collapsed. We just spent a century calling survival by the wrong name. The 1,000-year story of Rapa Nui is not a story of people who destroyed themselves. It is a story of what destruction actually looks like when it comes from outside, and of what it takes to remain standing after it passes. The Moai are still there. The hands that shape them are still there. And the people who were told, for generations, that their ancestors were the architects of their own ruin, now have something that no textbook revision can fully restore, but that the evidence has nonetheless returned to them: the truth. Thank you for watching. If this story changed how you think about Easter Island, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what surprised you most. And if you want more hidden chapters of human history, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.